Welcome to Rebuilding the Republic, conversations about America's future here at the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director. Today's conversation is a partnership with UAlbany's Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. We're thrilled to be here with Julie Suk, author of We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment, the true story of the truly epic, ongoing, 100-year-long battle to secure constitutional equality for women in America. It's a multi-generational story with a rich and varied cast of characters. You can read more about Julie Suk and We the Women right here on this page. You can also purchase a copy of the book via a link to an independent bookstore here on this screen. With us today to lead the conversation is our frequent programming collaborator, Dr. Janell Hobson, Chair of the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. The author of several books, Dr. Hobson is also a frequent contributor to Ms. Magazine. She recently edited and published the Routledge Companion to Black Women's Cultural Histories, just out in March, and available as an ebook as well. Her new book, When God Lost Her Tongue, Historical Consciousness and the Black Feminist Imagination, is forthcoming this fall. Janell, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark, for that introduction. And it's also my pleasure to be here to have an insightful conversation with Julie Suk on her recent book, We the Women, highlighting the fight for the Equal Rights Amendment. Also, it's a wonderful dovetailing with the theme of rebuilding the Republic, conversations about America's future. So I'm just going to ask a few questions to our author, and we'll just have a general discussion or conversation, really. So first, I do want to congratulate you on this book, Julie Suk, and I want to also ask you to give some background on the history of the Equal Rights Amendment, as well as its current status in terms of ratification, and why you chose to write a book on this subject.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark and Janell, for having me. It's an honor to be here to be part of this series. I wrote this book about the Equal Rights Amendment because as someone who studied law in the early 2000s, and as someone who was also a student of political philosophy, and I studied in Europe at the time, it was amazing to me that there were many countries that were amending their constitutions not only to put gender equality in the Constitution, which they had had since after World War II, but to modify what was already there to clarify the role of the government in actually promoting gender equality and particularly overcoming disadvantages that women faced in society. And so that led me to wonder, as someone studying the law, what happened to the Equal Rights Amendment? It's something that's a little bit of a footnote, or was treated as a little bit of a footnote in constitutional law, the amendment that was proposed but was never ratified and then expired and then forgotten for over a generation. It was not something that I studied as a law student, but I became increasingly curious about what it is about our Constitution that made something that seems to be a staple in almost every constitution in democracies around the world. What makes this staple not part of the US Constitution, and why did it fail for so long? And that's really the question that I tried to answer in We the Women. And so just telling that story, the Equal Rights Amendment is a constitutional amendment that would guarantee equality of rights between women and men. It's phrased specifically, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The amendment was introduced in 1923 on the heels of the 19th Amendment, which is known as the Women's Suffrage Amendment. It's a constitutional amendment that prohibits the denial of the right to vote on account of sex. But the 19th Amendment, which was a great victory for women in the United States, only referred to the right to vote. And there were many laws at the time that discriminated against women, excluded married women from property rights, gave women lesser rights than men with regard to parental authority over their own children, and many, many other laws that essentially excluded women did not make them full participants in the economic and political and social life of the community and the nation. So, so the Equal Rights Amendment was supposed to end the second class status of women, but it never really got off the ground. And it's important to note that our Constitution has a specific rule for amending it. You need 2/3 of both houses of Congress and then 3/4 of the state legislatures to ratify an amendment before it can get added to the Constitution. Well, there were efforts to introduce it in Congress, and the Senate voted by 2/3 majority a couple of times in the 1950s, but you didn't get that 2/3 vote by both houses of Congress until 1971 and 1972. And at that point, it went to the states for ratification. But because of the civil rights movement and the women's movement, initially, many states just ratified the ERA very quickly. They thought it was a no-brainer that men and women should be equal and that it should be in the Constitution. So, so many states ratified in the first year. But things started to slow down because remember, if you need 3/4 of the states, that's 38 states. And really by the end of 1973, a little over a year after the ratifications began, they got up to 30 ratifications. And 30 is still a lot. That's like a super majority of the states, but still not enough to add an amendment under the rule that we have that our founding fathers wrote in 1787. So by 1977, 35 states had ratified it. And the reason things slowed down was that people started to ask questions, and specifically a very powerful conservative women's movement led by Phyllis Schlafly tried to stop the ratifications. They worried that having equality in all spheres might actually endanger the role of mothers in the family. And it changed the culture so much around women's roles within the family as mothers and housewives. So that's very much why it stalled. And the stalling is a very important part of the story as to why we don't have it today, because Congress, when it adopted the amendment by that 2/3 vote in 1971 and 72, included a time limit on the states for ratification. The Congress said in the resolution that it would be a valid amendment when ratified within 7 years. So that 7-year time limit was coming up in 1979. Congress actually extended it. They took a vote in 1978 to extend the time limit to 1982, but no additional states ratified the amendment by 1982. So it was assumed that it was over and the ERA could then no longer be added to the Constitution. And then today it still matters, and I'm happy to talk further about it. There's been a revival because 3 states in the last 3 years have ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. So 2017, Nevada, after 40 years after the last state ratified it, Nevada comes and ratifies the ERA. Then in 2018, Illinois, and in 2020, Virginia. And Congress there have been resolutions introduced in Congress to lift the deadline so that we could validate those 3 ratifications. If those 3 ratifications are valid, that makes 38, which would be 3/4 of the states in keeping with a constitutional rule. But there are a lot of legal and political fights about the status of that time limit, whether or not it could be changed and lifted. And another issue facing the ERA now is that some states in the 1970s took votes to withdraw their ratifications.
Mm,
basically we've changed our minds.
mhm.
And so that's also a very interesting legal question as to whether states can change their minds and whether Congress can
Mhm.
reject
Yeah.
their rescissions.
Mhm. Wow. So so the struggle continues basically.
Yes.
And I do find it interesting. In your book, you do talk about the way the conservative women's movement under Phyllis Schlafly really was effective in stalling the progress on the ERA. And it reminds me, even now, when we think of back in 2016, when we came very close to having our first woman president with Hillary Clinton, there was much that was made about how so many conservative women did not vote for her. And it
Mhm.
was like 53%, at least that was one of those statistics that put out, of white women who
Mhm.
voted against Hillary Clinton. So it just reminds me that there always seems to be this push and pull in terms of women's movement and what it means for certain pushback against gender equality, not necessarily coming from men, but from other women. And I wonder if you could talk about that and what we can learn from that history, or even learn from what's going on even today.
Absolutely. Well, it's not new. There were women who opposed women's suffrage
Yeah, that's
uh,
true. Mm-hmm.
over 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, well, part of the interesting story of Phyllis Schlafly is that she was actually not at all interested in the Equal Rights Amendment as it was raging through Congress in 1970. She was actually running for Congress herself, and she didn't breathe a word about the ERA or her opposition to it in her campaign for Congress in 1970. And in 1970, that was when the ERA got a 96% vote in the House
Mm-hmm.
after never having had a vote in the House for decades.
Mm-hmm.
So it's quite curious that she lost her congressional campaign, Phyllis Schlafly,
Mm-hmm.
and she lost to a man who said Phyllis Schlafly should just stay home with her kids
Mm-hmm.
and her husband and not run against me for Congress. You know, and it's very interesting because it's really in 1972 that Phyllis Schlafly is in touch with one of the most vocal congressional opponents of the ERA, Sam Ervin,
Mm-hmm.
in the Senate from North Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
And she starts opposing the ERA and starts her newsletters against the ERA. And I think it's really, I mean, she was already a well known political figure, but I think her mark in history, and she becomes almost like a world historical figure by being a woman who opposes feminism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one dynamic is that there has always been something to gain for women who oppose feminism
Mm-hmm.
politically.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to be aware of that dynamic. The other thing I think we need to be aware of that we almost don't talk about, we almost act like there was kind of a fair culture war and there were as many women who were against the ERA as there were for the ERA. But
Mm-hmm.
we have to understand that a lot of the debates that we have are actually structured by a political process. And they're structured by a political process that empowers certain voices. And sometimes it empowers certain voices even when those voices don't represent most of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I really do try to pay attention to in the book because it's not just Stop ERA and Phyllis Schlafly.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's crucial in the United States that Illinois
Mm-hmm.
um, is a battlefield on the ERA and it's defeated. But actually, in Illinois, the majority of both houses of the legislature voted to ratify the ERA.
Mm-hmm.
Several times. It's just that in Illinois, they happen to have a rule that requires 60% of the vote
Mm-hmm.
in order to ratify. And that's why it was, in some ways, easier. It's easier for someone like Phyllis Schlafly to defeat something when there's such a high bar to getting it passed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's much easier to defeat something by putting a little bit of misinformation and confusion out there if the people who want to get it passed need to meet a 60% threshold rather than a 51%
Mm-hmm.
threshold. And similarly, I think you mentioned Hillary Clinton in 2016. Well, she won the popular vote And that also tells you we have a structure in terms of how we elect the president of the United States through the Electoral College and through overrepresentation of certain states that actually does not necessarily reflect what the majority of the American people really want. So, and I think it is increasingly important to think about that. I mentioned earlier too, that there has been activity. A majority of the House voted twice now to remove the ERA deadline. The Senate didn't act on it last year. And it's not clear whether the Senate will act on it this year, even though we know that most likely there are 51 votes in the Senate to pass the deadline removal, but because, again, we have a political process that's structured by certain rules that empower vocal minorities. So the filibuster rule makes it so that you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass legislation, and anyone who's really, any senator who doesn't like something and is willing to be a pain about it kind of threatens to filibuster, and then something that the majority of the people support doesn't become legislation. So I think it's important to understand that Phyllis Schlafly's success in the culture wars is a success that's enabled by a certain political structure that doesn't necessarily reflect what the people in a democracy really want and doesn't necessarily reflect our values.
Which is such an important point for you to make because it then I think brings up the question of, so how do we better educate the populace to think about the political process? I'm thinking of civic education, for example, because you will have people who get defeated because, oh, so and so got the popular vote but didn't get the electoral votes, etc., or this didn't get ratified in Congress. I'm thinking of just progressive people who don't always seem to pay attention to what political participation means or even what the process might be. What are some ways that we can really get more involved, but also to get more informed?
Well, I think you're absolutely right to focus on civics education and not just having more civics education, but changing the way that we do civics education in the United States. So I think we are taught to revere our founding fathers. I think that's changing a little bit since when I was a child, but not that much. I mean, I think we have to read the Constitution not only as a document that reflects some of the values that we hold dear, like we live in a republic that's representative. We believe in freedom of assembly and press. We believe in equal protection of the laws, right? So it has certain values that are very important to us, but there's a lot in the Constitution that is obsolete. It is one of the oldest constitutions in the world. Most countries have rewritten their constitutions in the 20th century. So we are using something of a horse and carriage instead of a fast train. And so it's something that does need an update. And we also have an amendment rule that makes our Constitution one of the most difficult to change. And it was written by people who had values. They also owned slaves. And so they weren't perfect. And even if they had been perfect in 1787, they could not possibly have predicted all of the ways in which the world would change. But I think that the way that we are taught civics as children, all the way through high school, is a culture of reverence for the Constitution rather than a healthy critical perspective on the Constitution. And the sense of agency around changing the Constitution. Our amendment rule is also one of the few amendment rules. I mean, even if you look at state constitutions in the United States, most of the states' constitutions can be amended with some participation by the people, either by a ballot initiative or there's an amendment that goes to a popular referendum, so voters get to weigh in. Ours is just Congress and the states. And typically most of our amendments have been made by Congress and state legislatures taking a vote or taking action. So I think having a more critical perspective when we do civics education, and the way that we can do that is not just by trashing the founding fathers because they they held slaves. I think there is a temptation to kind of do that. But I think more importantly, it's important. We need to engage constitutions outside of the United States. There are many countries that have written constitutions and have done different things that might work better from the standpoint of equality and inclusion. We can also just look within our own borders. We can look at state constitutions that are more modern than the national federal constitution that we tend to revere so much. So I think I think we need to start with that, just having a different attitude towards the document that governs our political life.
Well, thank you for saying that, because I think so much of political participation is not just what can you change in the law, but also how you bring a certain consciousness to changing the law. And I'm also thinking of the kind of social changes that have occurred in our nation and as well as the world. I noticed that in your book you did touch on the current movement of Me Too, and I'm wondering what you think would be the impact of something like Me Too on the Equal Rights Amendment, or even the reverse. What would the impact of the Equal Rights Amendment do for a movement like Me Too?
Great. Well, I think that there's been kind of a dialogue between the movement, the Me Too movement, and the efforts to complete the ERA. And I think the best example is Illinois. Illinois, of course, has a history of ERA being unfinished business because there were so many efforts that came so close in the 1970s and early 1980s to ratify the ERA in Illinois, although they ultimately did not ratify it. And then they finally ratified it in 2018, decades after the time limit. So, but when they did ratify it, Me Too was definitely part of the story in Illinois because about a few months before they took the vote to ratify it, the Me Too movement was in full gear because Harvey Weinstein, all the allegations against Harvey Weinstein came to light in the press that fall before Illinois voted to ratify the ERA. And the movement then pointed the spotlight on the Illinois legislature and Illinois state level politics as being a place where women felt that they were often harassed, they were subject to unwanted comments, they were generally not treated as equals, and they were sexualized. And so there was a petition and a lot of attention brought to that. And the legislatures, both houses of the Illinois legislature, created a task force to study sexual violence and made proposals to change policies. And one of the things that also happened around this time, because there was increased attention to these women's issues around sexual harassment and violence, and imbalances of power resulting from and also causing the sexual harassment and violence, the legislature, the women in the legislature formed a women's caucus. And one of the first things that they thought they needed to do was ratify the Equal Rights Amendment. A lot of what goes on with ratifying the Equal Rights Amendment is that it's kind of a political force field that is talking about this foundational principle that you would put into the foundational document is a way of anchoring many other more specific policy proposals around gender equality. And I think that's the most important thing that the ERA does. With regard specifically to how it might change laws or policies around sexual violence and the problems brought to light by the Me Too movement, it's largely in Section 2 of the ERA. The Section 2 of the ERA, so Section 1 says equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So what that means is that if any state level actor, like a government employee, government employer, or even like a governor, or anyone who's acting on behalf of the state, if they are discriminating or somehow denying people equality of rights on account of sex. That would be unconstitutional under the ERA.
Mhm.
But most importantly, Section 2 of the ERA gives Congress the power to enforce equal rights.
Mhm.
And that's really important because in the past, Congress has passed laws that are supposed to create robust remedies for sexual violence. So, for example, the Violence Against Women Act, which has many, many different provisions.
Mhm.
But one of the provisions that existed in 1994, when the Violence Against Women Act was passed,
Mhm.
was the possibility of suing a perpetrator of gender motivated violence
Mhm.
in a federal court. And the
Mhm.
Supreme Court actually struck that down
Mhm.
in a case called United States versus Morrison in 2000.
Mhm.
And the Supreme Court struck it down, saying that under the existing Constitution, Congress, the federal legislature, did not have power to reach private and local matters like violence between private parties.
Mhm.
Uh, so as a result, and there are many other Supreme Court decisions that have called into question the extent to which Congress can adopt robust policies that
Mhm.
regulate not just the state, but also private parties and corporations
Mhm.
with regard to the dynamics that cause gender inequality.
Mhm.
So the Equal Rights Amendment would make it really clear that Congress has a mandate to not just prohibit discrimination, but to promote real equality.
Mhm. Okay. You bring up the Supreme Court, so I'm thinking of a different social movement around gender that is women's reproductive rights. And I'm
Mhm.
wondering, are you optimistic about reproductive rights with the very conservative Supreme Court that we have? I know many have been voicing their concerns that Roe v. Wade will be eventually overturned, and I wonder what you think or how you think with the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, women's legal reproductive rights can be protected.
Yeah, so Roe versus Wade, I think it was a very surprising decision when it came down in 1973 because there's no mention, obviously, of reproductive rights or abortion in the Constitution.
Mhm.
Um, there's just a guarantee of life, liberty, or property.
Mhm.
And our Constitution doesn't even mention privacy or privacy in the body, which is what we think Roe versus Wade is about.
Mhm.
So it was something that judges read into the liberty guarantee in the existing 14th Amendment.
Mhm.
And many countries around the world that have had a more stable protection for reproductive rights
Mhm.
have gotten it because the legislature, like Parliament or Congress, has protected that right.
Mhm.
So I think I'm hopeful that the legislature and many state legislatures have actually passed laws guaranteeing reproductive rights. And some states are even considering doing their own state constitutional amendments
Mhm.
protecting reproductive rights to some degree. Because I think that Roe, because again, we have such an old constitution that's so hard to amend,
Mhm.
Roe always anchored the right to terminate a pregnancy
Mhm.
on constitutional guarantees that don't really seem exactly to be about that,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Now, an equal rights amendment would probably be a little bit closer because it says equality of rights can't be abridged on account of sex. And
Mhm.
it's very clear from its history
Mhm.
that its framers always believed that the point of the ERA, that its purpose was
Mhm.
to end the second class citizenship of women.
Mhm.
And it's really hard to imagine ending women's second class citizenship if there's no reproductive freedom.
Mhm.
Women disproportionately bear the burden
Mhm.
of bringing children into this world,
Mhm.
um, even though we all benefit from women's work in that domain. We
Mhm.
get to have a new generation of
Mhm.
citizens, children, people to love, people to vote, people to work in our economy.
Mhm.
But women do shoulder most of the biological burden of making that new generation
Mhm.
happen.
Yes.
So given
And
the
often unpaid too.
And so given that that's the case, if we want women to be equal, then it seems like some forms of reproductive freedom have to be part of what's meant by equality of rights. But I think that we need to have a national conversation about which forms of reproductive freedom, including the right to terminate a pregnancy under some circumstances, but also very importantly, the right to bear children without it ruining your life, the right to have a child without it being an economic disaster.
Yes.
And I don't think this country has reached that place
No.
where the decision, many people want to be mothers, but know that they will face discrimination in the workplace. They will face a lifetime of compromised earnings and opportunities because of a decision to have a child. And sometimes those compromised opportunities and the lack of economic security will not only affect the woman, but affects our children. And affects the economic life, makes the economic life of our nation less than it can and should be. So I think that we need to have a much broader conversation about reproductive freedom and reproductive justice that includes not only the right to terminate a pregnancy, but also the right to carry out a pregnancy to term and raise children.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for saying that. You're reminding me of some really important work that's happening on the ground, especially among low-income women, women of color. I'm thinking specifically of Loretta Ross, who helped to found the Sister Song, a movement for reproductive justice, deliberately using the term reproductive justice instead of reproductive rights, so that it encompasses not just the right to terminate a pregnancy, but the right to have children, to also be able to bear children, linking that even to a movement like Black Lives Matter in terms of the right for your children to be safe without being subject to state violence.
Absolutely. Well, there's also, I mean, it's so important because we talk about Black Lives Matter, and another huge issue with regard to Black Lives Mattering is the very high rates of maternal mortality
Yes.
amongst Black women.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, this country falls far short of many similar advanced, wealthy democracies with regard to maternal health outcomes generally.
Yes.
But then Black women have much higher rates of maternal mortality than other women. And I think that is a huge crisis that also has to be addressed. And we also need to talk about pregnant worker fairness, because if people really want to protect unborn life, many women have miscarriages on the job because the law doesn't require accommodations to protect pregnant workers' health. At least at the federal level, we don't have that law, the Pregnant Worker Fairness Act, even though an increasing number of states have now enacted pregnant worker fairness laws.
Oh, another important point. Thank you for raising that. Of it's the kind of conversations that you never hear, even when you have a kind of counter discourse around the unborn, and then here you're talking about miscarriages. Here you're talking about maternal mortality, infant mortality, especially among certain groups and Black women in particular. I'm glad you mentioned that. I did notice in your book, We the Women, you did pay attention to the multiracial levels of organizing among women, and I thought it was great to see you give a historical overview of that, how women's movements have been multiracial and continue to be. And yet, the feminist movement has always had tensions among various feminists based on race, sexual orientation, and other issues of difference. So, what do you think are the best strategies for unity and coalition building among women of multiracial and gender backgrounds?
Well, I think that it is really important to note that motherhood is a theme that unites women across race and class, and is experienced also by LGBTQ women. Which is not to say, I know that not all women become mothers.
Hmm.
But well, it's actually really interesting that in the United States, 86% of women actually give birth at least once by the time they reach the end of their childbearing years. So I do think that that's also an area where there's so much polarization, partisan polarization
Hmm.
around issues like abortion. People have different religious and moral outlooks on that. But I think on the flip side, when we talk about reproductive justice and reproductive freedom,
Hmm.
as the proposition that if you choose to be a mother,
Hmm.
it shouldn't bankrupt you. I
Hmm.
mean, I think that's a proposition on which I think a lot of women can agree, whether they choose to become mothers or not.
Hmm. And how do you see the women's movement making room for other types of gender identities? For example, gender non-binary individuals and communities. And I know that within certain movements, there's always an interest in not wanting to gender essentialize. So, for example, you said being a mother is an identity that women across races, class differences, sexual orientation differences can actually rally around. But then there are those who can't be mothers, those who identify as women but may not have uteruses. I mean, there are just so many different, or even those who choose not to be mothers deliberately. The 14% that you mentioned in that particular demographic. What do you think? How do we see the women's movement encompassing that kind of diversity in terms of gender identity?
Yeah, I think, well, it depends on, I think there are many different agendas.
Hmm.
And right now, I think that when we talk about law and public policy,
Hmm.
I don't think that the term woman or mother has to be essentializing
Hmm.
uh, in the sense, but I do think it's important to center that experience,
Hmm.
because if you just trace back to the exclusion of women from legal rights,
Hmm.
that exclusion was premised on women's role as both biological and social uh, caregiver.
Yeah.
And so the development of the status of women has always been tied to motherhood and caregiving and the home. So to kind of move into this new 20th, 21st century reality, uh, paying attention to those issues makes sense. That
Hmm.
doesn't mean that it's okay to discriminate
Hmm.
against non-binary people.
Hmm.
But I think in the same way that we can understand that the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment,
Hmm.
was primarily adopted to end the inferior legal status of
Hmm.
formerly enslaved African Americans.
Hmm.
That was its purpose, and that centers our understanding of racial injustice in this country. And that doesn't mean then that it's okay to discriminate against Asian Americans or Native Americans or immigrant,
Hmm.
the 14th Amendment protects all of us.
Yes.
But I think in the same way, I think the experience of women and mothers can center our understanding of why it's important for the law to change and make a commitment to a different type of social reality.
Hmm.
Uh, and the norm for which that legal change stands is one that's inclusive of many other marginalized genders, not only women.
Yeah. Well, I did notice in We the Women, you do pay attention to certain histories like Paulie Murray, who some
Mhm.
have identified as non-binary.
Yeah.
Um, and the work that Paulie Murray did was so, instrumental to Thurgood Marshall's and his work that he did with Brown versus Board of Education and also with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more of the legal legacy of different types of women and how we can actually, raise their profile. Because I think there's a new documentary film about Paulie Murray right now, but I teach women's gender and sexuality studies, and I'm always encountering students who've never heard of some of these names.
Yeah, so that's another reason why I wrote the book,
Mm-hmm.
because I think also we have forgotten about some of the pioneering women who were in Congress
Mm-hmm.
and what they said
Yes.
about why this amendment was needed. So part of it was just to tell that story and to get those voices. And that's why in the book also I insisted on having pictures of these women
Mm-hmm.
so that you could see them as people and see them as our founding mothers
Mm-hmm.
who are equal in brilliance and contributions to the constitutional order that we really ought to inhabit today. They're equal to our founding fathers.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Uh,
But Paulie Murray, I mean, I have always been really interested in their work. I struggle with the pronouns because in her lifetime, she would always, the possibility of using they as a pronoun or even he as a pronoun for Paulie Murray probably didn't really enter into any kind of realistic, plausible consciousness. So I have become accustomed to using the pronoun that Paulie Murray would have used for herself, although I know that there is a practice, and with the new documentary, some people use different pronouns for her. But I just want to acknowledge that there's a case for using any of the three pronouns with regard to Paulie Murray. So I hope that those who use other pronouns for her don't mind my using she.
yeah.
With that said, she wrote an article in 1965 called Jane Crow and the Law. And Jane Crow was basically like intersectionality before we had a multisyllabic word for it. And I think it was this experience of never quite belonging, always being kind of erased and rejected, that really made her contributions so crucial and so brilliant, because it was really from the beginning. We have a legal order and a constitution that's not inclusive. How do we make it inclusive? And how do we learn from the different strategies used by the different groups that have been excluded?
Yeah. And especially those who are falling through the cracks, as you put it, in terms of being at the intersections,
Yeah.
that enables them to really be able to come at the law or to come at any movement from that particular perspective. So that it reminds me of the Combahee River Collective when they put out their Black feminist statement in 1977. Barbara Smith, who is local here in the Capital Region,
Yeah.
and talked about when Black women are free, everybody else gets free. And they especially meant that for those who are most marginalized, like Paulie Murray. Really important stuff for us to think about um, just because of that particular marginalized perspective.
Absolutely.
hmm So, but we are moving from margin to center, as Bell Hooks would say. I'm quoting all my Black feminists, and it was really interesting to me now is especially with the last election where there was so much emphasis on Black women are saving America, which really the response to that is Black women are saving themselves, but there is added benefit for everybody else because when we are free, everybody else is free, right? So there's Stacey Abrams. There's also electing someone like Kamala Harris as the first Black woman vice president, first woman and first Black vice president. And so I think about political participation as well as political representation. And how soon do you think we will have a woman president of the United States? And should that even be a goal for our feminist movement?
Well, I think it's shameful that we haven't had one yet. We're pretty slow,
Yeah.
late to that party compared to many peer democracies around the world.
hmm
But I think the explanation really has to do, again, with our Constitution and our the institutions that we have by which we do politics.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the Electoral College and a two-party system make it harder
Mm-hmm.
for women to succeed. I think there are systems that have ranked choice voting, systems that have proportional representation, which make it more likely. Many other countries also started legislating. So they were where we are now. We have 25% women in Congress. Many countries in the 80s, when they were at that point, started implementing quotas so that every political party had to run an equal number of male and female candidates. And they had constitutional struggles about that, because that's kind of like a quota is kind of like affirmative action. And sometimes the Supreme or constitutional courts in other countries said you can't do that. And that's why they got these new equality amendments in the late 1990s and early 2000s in many European countries, to make it clear that if you had a quota to overcome women's underrepresentation, that would be a promotion of equality rather than a violation of equality. But I think many other countries have paid attention to the process and the structures for politics, because they recognize that the way you set up the game affects who wins.
Yes, absolutely. And I think we see some really interesting examples coming out of different African countries, as well as the Nordic countries. I mean, so many different examples. I'm glad you mentioned that we really need to look beyond just our own US Constitution and look at the globe, in terms of who is doing democracy differently and maybe even more effectively.
Yes, absolutely.
So, my final question, so we can wrap things up. So, how do we raise the consciousness of the younger generation to take an interest in the Equal Rights Amendment?
Well, there's a wonderful group called Generation Ratify,
Mm-hmm.
and they have been organizing in many states now to draw attention specifically to the Equal Rights Amendment. I think that young people are extremely engaged.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I don't think it got much traction, but I know that there was an effort, I believe, by Cori Bush to lower the voting age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I would actually be in favor of it. I think there are other countries that have lowered the voting age to 16.
Mm-hmm.
But I think even if we don't do that, even if we don't lower the voting age,
Mm-hmm.
I'm really excited by what I see. I think young people are extremely engaged. They're using social media. I think we need to be careful because I think on social media, there's a tendency of people to really, on Twitter, just read some sound bites and not really engage. So we need to create spaces that are really deliberative, where young people can not just tap into technology and get the sound bites, but really have debates and have opportunities to encounter people who are different from them and disagree with them. I think that is one of the biggest challenges right now with young people, but I'm at the same time very heartened by what I see, because I think there are kids who are finding the Equal Rights Amendment really exciting, and they're forming organizations, they're having Zoom events. Girl Up is another club. There was a high schooler who got in touch with me from her Girl Up club and interviewed me about the Equal Rights Amendment. So, and I've done some workshops with high school educators as well, where we talk about constitutions around the world. We talk about what's going on right now with the Equal Rights Amendment. And so I think all of those things, education, outreach, deliberative spaces.
Okay, well, thank you so much for answering all of my questions.
Well, thank you, Janell. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Yeah, same here.
The book is We the Women, the Unstoppable Mothers of the Equal Rights Amendment. It's available for purchase from an indie bookstore via a link on this screen. If you'd like to get Julie's actual pen and ink autograph on a nameplate to paste into your book. She invites you to write to her directly. We have a link to her email address on this page. Thanks so much, Julie Suk and Janell Hobson. Let me remind you that this and all our author interviews are posted on the Writers Institute's YouTube channel, and you can find them at the conversation on our website, nyswritersinstitute.org. And please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. To our audience, thanks so much for tuning in. Be well.